especially improvement mindset, and share that. Everybody owns quality in one fashion or another, as Dr. Edwards Demings mentioned. So practical consideration here, team. Take the time to establish as best as you could some type of quality metrics. Start with one and then build upon that as an example. And if you could measure something, you could subsequently improve upon it. Always remember, like Dr. Deming said, anybody has an opinion. The data and the trust and confidence in the data could then subsequently be improved upon. Okay, it's approaching the top of the hour. This could be a good time again to take you basically ask yourself, what are the risks that we know about in this project when you're in the initiation, getting it off the ground, creating the project charter, things of that nature. Conversely, the project sponsor is basically saying their interest in the overall project and exposure to the effects of uncertainty. So they're simply asking, how risky is my project? How risky of doing the project? Sometimes how risky of not doing the project. Okay? And so two different perspectives. This is an example of a risk register. And I recommend, if you are not utilizing this type of tool, this is a simple example. Again, it could be a simple spreadsheet where you have the name of the risk. Every risk needs to have an owner, what caused it, what is the reason of the risk, etc., etc. And to what degree or impact? Is it high, medium, low, red, yellow, green, maybe a percentage? And then what is the strategy for the owner to remediate it somehow, some way? Risk register. Risk in an uncertain world. Everything is uncertain. We live in a very dynamic, uncertain, volatile, sometimes confusing world. Okay? So from a Project Management Institute, uncertain events or conditions that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on the overall project. Describing something as a risk is saying an unknown state may or may not occur. And if something did occur, obviously it's a fact. If something will occur, there is no uncertainty, meaning there's no risk. They use the example, the sun will come up tomorrow as an example. So let's look at some of the building blocks associated with risk, centered around uncertainty. A situation may or may not occur. Variability. Every process has some level of variability. It is the uncertainty about the degree of variability in a process and or uncertainty about the actual variability within, say, acceptable limits. And they use as an example shooting at a target, for example. So if you look at accuracy when compared to precision, accuracy focuses on how close. Precision, consistency is focused. So for example, the box on the bottom left, the group 1, this grouping is on average accurate, but it's not consistent. Conversely, group 2, this grouping is consistent, but it's not accurate. Something to think about when you're putting together risk, quality metrics, things of that nature. This is an example of a variety of tools to help identify project risk. Okay, these tools can suggest possible causes, and they can be used as input, say for saying, okay, here's what the data is saying. Let's get together some type of collaboration workshop to brainstorm. How do we resolve this? This is one of those techniques called the PESTLE: political, economic, social, technical, technological, legal, and environmental. And this example is a real life example when the pandemic first started. Okay, and it shows the risk surfacing, say, by media coverage. And it provided insights to a company in how the virus coverage exposed the political, economic, et cetera, and this risk technique aided companies who were faced with unprecedented levels of risk that involved, say, travel restrictions, resource, supply chain restrictions, et cetera, that large, call it food chain. So this is an example of a risk technique. So let me ask you, let's take just a few seconds in the group chat. What risk techniques have you used successfully? Anybody? What risk technique? I listed about half a dozen. Have any of you utilized a risk technique successfully? I appreciate it. Probability versus feasibility. Okay, I like that. RS says. What if scenarios? That is very, very good. That's a simple technique. What if this? What if that? Then, if then else kind of thing. I like that, LE. DER goes on to say, we identified risk and have to enumerate the path to get on track. Very good. And IO goes on to say, none of the ones you listed, but have used, I love it. Strength, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats. Very, very good. Thank you for noting that, IO, the SWOT analysis. And that, by the way, could be not only for your company, but for the customer you're serving in your project. Very, very good. Thank you, team. All right, so now let's talk about the level of risk. The level of risk on the left, the implicit risk management, which is typically early in the project life cycle, structure, scope, et cetera, versus throughout the project life cycle, explicit risk management, addressing individual risks accordingly, level of risk. And chance and probability. Chance is the possibility of something happening, but when you define it mathematically, it's called probability. Simple example, I got a coin. I toss it, 50% could be heads, 50% could be tails. And each coin toss is independent of any previous toss. So the example conclusion of what I would like to call, say, a practical consideration. While the probability, as an example of tossing 10 heads in a row, is extremely low, the chance of any single toss is still 50-50. Chance and probability when it looks at risk. So common project risks, the cost, the schedule, the performance. But other type of risk may be outside of your realm. Maybe governance, maybe the marketplace, could be a pandemic, like I just indicated. Okay? Common risk that may not be internal to your company, the customer's company, but external. So when you look at risk management framework, kind of like the framework of the communication plan we talked about earlier, how do you handle something such as project risk management. You make a management plan. The process can make management more manageable, I should say, and take a possible disadvantage and could now turn it into an advantage. Identifying risk. We talked about earlier, you could brainstorm, okay? You could drill down into, say, the 5 whys. For those of you that joined one of my previous classes, we talked about the 5 whys, how you could eventually drill down to get the true root cause. And sometimes trust your intuition, your gut, your feeling. I feel it's going to this. And you want to collect and place all data in a risk register and make sure each risk has a risk owner. Okay, and you want to leverage, say, industry best practices, whether it be in the healthcare, in the manufacturing, things of that nature, as an example. And you want to prioritize in that risk register, red, yellow, green, maybe a percentage. This risk is 80% probability of going to happen. We got to get in front of it. Okay, how are we going to immediately remediate it? So you want to have an owner. You want to make sure every risk has a person responsible for it not to jeopardize your project. You want to respond. Okay, and you want to have communications with regard to the risk owners in the risk register. And then it gets back to communication. You want to make sure there's a channel of communication to stay on top of mitigating a particular risk, especially important ones. So this is our last exercise, team. And this is an exercise, a case study that, again, we'll do together. But this particular case, again, is a real-life situation that occurred at Heathrow Airport in the UK. And so what I want to do, let's walk through this in a similar manner like we did with the communication one. And feel free to chime in any comment or thought in the group chat window. So this project was called T5. And the background was T5 was one of the largest construction projects at the time in Europe. And the project ran like clockwork. Interestingly enough, and I'll give you specifics on how and why that took place. The schedule, budget, things to that nature. But the success was contributed by proactive collaboration, that communication I talked about, yet the commitment by the client and the associated contractors that were all part of this large project, working together in a risk management plan. So, the project activities of this project included the client developed a unique procurement contract strategy to retain all financial risk. I thought that was interesting, to retain all financial risk. But in the same token, they created an incentive measurement strategy that rewarded the suppliers in terms of best practices. And they invested heavily on the soft skills. I thought that was also interesting, team. The soft skills, the communication we talked about, the leadership I talked about. And this in turn helped to develop strong relationships, team building. Okay? And one of the interesting points that surfaced up front was an example of constructing what they called a terminal roof trial. And this trial completed sections that were planned to be erected in huge ton lifts, if you will, that weighed obviously a lot. And to minimize issues and mishaps, this roof team funded to conduct a dummy run to look at the feasibility of this terminal roof trial. Well, lo and behold, this trial was credited to saving 3 months of on-site and costs associated with the project. Interesting. Risk, feasibility, a dummy run, what if, etc. Things to think about. So the conclusion team of this large complex project, before starting the project, the customer realized conventional contracts are not going to work because the risk fell on the contractors, and that at times is where it gets very messy, very legal in nature, okay? So the customer accepted and managed the risk. But the key to success was aligning the attitude, the expectation, the relationships across the board. The project team, the stakeholder, the contractors, the suppliers, everybody was aligned in that type of attitude and expectation. So when it was all said and done, all projects are risky. The outcome is uncertain. The variability that I talked about earlier has to be managed. Okay? Managing risk is safer than simply ignoring it. And the client ability to manage risk in this particular case was extremely important. And it requires a mature risk attitude at all levels to achieve success and a win-win situation for you, your project team, and the customer you're serving. So team, feel free to utilize some of these concepts in this particular project case study to maybe improve some of your risk concepts. So now what I'd like to do, because each of these courses involve the